Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to welcome you to this online debate of human freedom in Hungary and Slovenia. My name is Šárka Prát. I am a board member of the European Liberal Forum and executive director of the Czech think tank called Institute for Politics and Society. Despite that this time you are only watching us from your computer screens, mobile phones, or tablets, glad that you are able to join us. Let me welcome you on behalf of the European Liberal Forum, which I have the honor of being a member of the board. The European Liberal Forum brings together almost 50 liberally oriented think tanks, institutions, and foundations from all over Europe and beyond. Together, we are creating a space for dialogue on European integration, liberal policies, ideas, and above all, the future of Europe. Discussion on such topics should be encouraged in regard to the current conditions at this time. The year 2020 is marked by the global pandemic of COVID-19, bringing with it economical, social, and political troubles. No country in Europe has left untouched. Today, we would like to mainly discuss the situation in Hungary and Slovenia and debate the status of the basic freedoms. Throughout Central Europe, politicians exploited the fear and ignorance of the people to gain power. Policies were put forth that benefited the politicians themselves rather than the country. Access to information through press conferences and other governmental pathways was no longer readily available, leaving the people lacking knowledge on the virus. Personal data was also compromised as protection was reduced through the use of contact tracing applications. Democracy and liberalism are being challenged every day through these COVID times. But were these were governments within their rights in putting freedom of health, or did they do personal gain? What do the citizens of these countries think? These are the questions that must be asked and answered in the new era of COVID. On behalf of the European Liberal Forum, allow me to wish you a pleasant debate, and I firmly believe that the fruitful discussion to which we are accustomed to during our events will be reflected in a virtual form.
Thank you very much, Šárka. Hi, I'm Daniel Mikec. I'm going to be the moderator of the discussion, and I'd like to ask our colleague Judith Székely to present the findings of our research of Republikon Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. First of all, I will share my screen to present you the results. Just a few seconds. Yes, I hope it will work. So in this presentation, I will show you the results of the two surveys that Republikon Institute conducted with the support of the European Liberal Forum. These two surveys were conducted both in Slovenia and Hungary in this September. And the three main topics of the survey were the evaluation of the handling of the pandemic during its first wave, the state of human rights, and finally, the European Union's role in the fight against COVID-19. First, I would like to present you the results of the questions about the general feeling of people about the political situation in their country. We can see that in Slovenia, 56% of people said that they distrust their government, this number in Hungary is 29%. And the amount of people who said they trust their government is 23 and 40%. So we can see that less than half of the population could say that they trust their government. We can see in the case of democracy, we ask people how satisfied are they with the way democracy is working in their country. And we can see that Slovenian people said 62% of them said that they are dissatisfied with the way democracy works in their country. 33% in Hungary said the same. And the ratio of people who are satisfied with the way democracy works is 21% in Slovenia and 35% in Hungary. Moving on to more coronavirus-related specific questions, we asked them about their opinion about the government strategy for COVID-19. And we can again see that people are critical of the political situation, as 53% of Slovenes said they are dissatisfied with their government strategy. 27% said the same in Hungary. And there's 32 and 44% in the two countries who are satisfied with their government strategy. Another very important question was that what people think about if their government misused its power during this period of time. And in Slovenia, more than 2/3 of people thought that the government misused its power during the pandemic. In Hungary, 24% said they think the government misused its power, and 49% said that government used it properly. This ratio of people in Slovenia is 19%. We also asked people about the what do they consider as are the important actors in this situation, and we can see that in both countries, individual responsibility considered as a very important actor during a pandemic situation. Most people mark individual responsibility as an important actor in Slovenia. And in Hungary, in first place, there are the doctors. We can also see about this data that besides these two actors, there are no big differences. We can see that almost the same amount of people consider important the European Union's role, the government's role, or the municipalities. And also there are the same ratio of people who said the police and the media are important actors, as 51% mark them important. Moving on to the important measures. In case of the measures, we see that there is two specific measures that in both countries were marked as important by the respondents. In Slovenia, most people mark the limitation of the number of participants in events as an important measure. And in Hungary, wearing mask is marked by 81% of people as an important measure. And just to summarize this part of the survey quickly, we can see that in both countries, in both Slovenia and Hungary, people are critical of the political situation in their country, also about their government strategy for COVID-19. We could see that 2/3 of Slovenian people experienced some anomaly in how their government used its power during the first wave of the pandemic. And in Slovenia, individual responsibility, in Hungary, doctors marked by the most people as an important actor, while in Slovenia, limitation of the number of participants in events, and in Hungary, wearing masks was marked by most people as important measures. Moving on to the main topic of today's conference, the state of human rights. We asked people about their opinion about the restrictions that was made in connection with the restriction movement in Slovenia. We asked people about their opinion about the decisions about the restrictions movement between municipalities. And more than 2/3 of people said that they consider these decisions inappropriate during the pandemic. In Hungary, we asked about the more general curfew restrictions, and we can see that it's more divisive question, as 41% of people said that they think that these decisions are appropriate during a pandemic. 27% said that these are inappropriate. We also asked the respondents about the free traveling, the restriction of free traveling during the pandemic, and we can see that in both countries more people can support more these measures, but there are different opinions, as 54% said that these decisions are appropriate in Slovenia, and 47% in Hungary said the same. After that, we asked about specific rights. What are the people's opinion about the state of the listed rights in this period of time? And we can see that in the case of the state of freedom of speech, Slovenes said that 57% of Slovenes said that it became worse. 35% of Hungarians said that it became worse, and 51% said that it didn't change. In Slovenia, 33%. We can see quite similar results in the case of the state of media freedom. 58% in Slovenia said that it became worse, 36% in Hungary. It's quite the same also in the case of the state of information freedom. 58% in Slovenia said that it became worse, and 33% in Hungary said that it became worse. 29% in Slovenia and 48% in Hungary stated that it didn't change. There are bigger differences in the case of the state of freedom of association. 79% of Slovenes said that it became worse, and 44% in Hungary said that it became worse. Moving on to the state of freedom to practice their people's religion. This is the area where people experience the less changes. We can see that 40% in Slovenia and 62% in Hungary said that it didn't change. And finally, the access to education. It's a very important question and very accurate at this time. 60% in Slovenia said that it became worse, and 49% said the same in Hungary, and almost the same ratio of people said in the two countries that it didn't change. It's 30 and 31%. And just quickly to summarize this part, we could see that 2/3 of Slovenes reject the measure restriction of movement between municipalities. Hungarians were less critical of curfew restrictions, but it is a divisive question. And in the case of the above listed rights, in all cases, more Slovenian people thought that these became worse. And in Slovenia, most people mark the state of freedom of association as a right that became worse. And in Hungary, it was the access to education. And finally, the third topic, the third main topic of the survey is the European Union's role in the fight against COVID-19. First of all, we also asked people about the restrictions that people could experience. And there's quite a big difference in how people think about these questions in the two countries in case of the European Union level, as more than 2/3 of people in Hungary support the idea to close the borders in the European Union, within the European Union, due to the virus situation. But in Slovenia, 51% said that even in the event of a virus spread, borders cannot be closed within the European Union. Also about the European Union, we can see that there are very different opinions about the measures that we could see in the European Union against the coronavirus. Then we asked people about specific measures, what the people think, how important are these measures. And we can see from the data that in Slovenia, most people marked as an important measure the collaboration of the countries of the European Union in the preparation of the doctors against the coronavirus. 76% who said that this measure is important. It's also the measure that most people marked as important in Hungary, as well as 86% said that this is important. And if we take a look at this graphic, we can see that in all cases, at least 60% think that the given measure is important. And we can see that in Slovenia, in Hungary, the lowest ratio of people who marked important and measure is in the case of the countries of the European Union supporting each other with the admission of patients. But in all cases, as I said, more than at least 60% of people said that these measures are important. There was a question about the European Union's role in the development of the vaccine. Also, there's one about the application of a uniform testing strategy. And just to quickly just say one more, that we asked also about the European level coordination of the restrictive measures against the coronavirus. And finally, we also wanted to know what people think about the European Union's role in the case if a member state misused its power, what people think, how important is it to intervene by the European Union if a member state misused its power? And in both countries, it seemed to be as an important thing by the people, as 84% in Slovenia said that it is important, and 63% said the same in Hungary. And just to quickly go through the most important conclusions in this topic, 2/3 of Hungarians support the idea of closing the borders during the pandemic. Slovenes seem to be more divided on this question. But we can also see that in both countries, people think that it is important to fight the virus on the European level as well. And also in both countries, people think that it is important to intervene by the European Union in the case if a national state misused its power. And that's it. Thank you for your attention, and let's continue with the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jutka, for the very interesting presentation. I think the data is it's quite interesting, the differences between the two countries. I can assume we can discuss it as well. Maybe you have a different opinion, but probably the Fidesz supporters said, or according to them, there was basically any kind of human rights infringement because actually the data from the Hungarian data, it was possible to see that the proportions between those who are critical vis-a-vis the government measures is quite the same as the proportion of opposition voters. But we might discuss it now at the discussion, because we are going to start the roundtable discussion of our event, which is just let me to say some words about this whole project. Basically, this event is part of the project Public Opinion and the State of Human Rights During the COVID-19 Pandemic in East Central Europe, where we assess the illiberal tendencies, freedom restrictions related to emergency measures, and centralization during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the subjective perception of these developments by citizens in the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovenia. However, at this event, as Sarka Prat also mentioned, we are going to focus on the Hungarian and the Slovenian case, but as part of this project, a publication is going to be published this year, where we are going to also have case studies from the Czech Republic and Poland. So let me first introduce the panelists or guests. Natasha Brishki, who is a journalist and editor-in-chief of Meta's List. András Kádár, who is the co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. Sebastian Pökl, who is the managing director of Slovenian think tank Novum and the partner of Republikon Institute in the European Liberal Forum. And Judit Székely, or researcher here at Republikon Institute, and I'm Daniel Mikec, also researcher at the Republikon Institute, and I'm going to moderate this discussion. So I think it's first I would ask you to have a first round. What's your opinion about the data? If you have any kind of reflection, and also if you don't want to reflect on the data, then my question would be: is just a general evaluation of the lockdown measures in your country. Maybe if you have some kind of personal input as well, how you experienced the lockdown, and if you experienced during these very specific lockdown measures any kind of infringement which could be perceived as human rights infringement during the springtime. First lockdown measures have been introduced, and I think we can, Natasha, we can start with you.
Okay, thank you. I lost a bit of your last sentences, but I think I know what you want us to talk about. So thank you very much for inviting me to the conference. It's a pleasure to participate in this debate. So it has been 7 months in Slovenia since we declared an epidemic. At the beginning of March, Slovenia confirmed the first case of coronavirus disease. And the same as pretty much every country in the European Union, the measures were not that much different. They included, testing, isolating patients, finding contacts, all the hygiene measures needed to try to stop the spread. With a number of exceptions, the current Slovenian government that started working on March 13 adopted a decree temporarily banning gatherings and movement of people in public places. Now, public transport was in Slovenia temporarily suspended by the government. The air traffic was shut down. We were mostly confined to our homes, working from home. All schools were closed. And they didn't start operating before the second half of May. We had new rules for when we were allowed to visit the grocery shops, strict social distancing rules. Life in Slovenia in March and April came to a complete halt, and due to a rising number of infections right these last days, we are again approaching more stricter measures to try to stop the virus in spreading. Now, many towns in Slovenia were locked down after reports, of people continuing to visit popular weekend destinations. Despite being advised to stay home, people were confined to their municipality. Now, the lockdown did open some dilemmas. For example, a person was allowed to take his or her dog for a walk in a nearby park, but not to go for a walk with a partner they do not live in the same household with. The government also passed new rules on lawmaking to speed up the implementation of laws designed to alleviate consequences of the epidemic. Now, however, the change remains of general application. I was talking to a colleague of mine covering public transport, and she told me that Slovenia was actually stopping the public transport, and the shutdown was sort of unique to Slovenia. Another unique thing, according to advocates for equality, was this designated hours for elderly. And my personal experience, me being a journalist, the government we got in March is waging sort of a war against the media. Literally within days, they got a hold on the governments. They started being really aggressive in criticizing the public national radio television, and it hasn't stopped for now it's been 7 months. It hasn't stopped since. So for many of my colleagues, times have been quite difficult. The special measures, of course, affected our work. Me personally, not so much, because the media network that I co-founded and the many podcasts that I do, we mostly do everything online and recording things via Skype or Zoom or things like that. So we were not particularly hardly hit, but that's not the case with the majority of my colleagues. And maybe we can talk a bit more later on the sort of a scapegoating of certain groups, and the media in Slovenia is definitely the one that's been under constant attack. One thing I might say also regarding the communications is, since this is my field, and the numbers that Judith showed us, how people are not really trusting the government measures, I would say are partially the result of really aggressive kind of communication in terms of we're going to do this. If you won't listen, if the numbers won't get better, then you will probably be stuck to your homes. Or it's the way they are communicating this has resulted in many protests that are running for 6-7 months now. And it doesn't, I was checking the latest surveys on the state of how people feel about living right now in the conditions that people are not feeling very optimistic at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you, Natasha. Maybe we can continue with the Slovenian case. I'm asking Sebastian if you want to reflect upon the data and on what also Natasha said, and what can you add to the for us to understand the Slovenian case?
Hello, also from my side. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Yes, I can mostly agree with Natasha what she said regarding different levels of governmental interventions. Though I would, if I just go briefly towards the data you presented, what actually strikes me the most here in the data is that your findings somehow show that around 56% of the survey per individuals said that they don't trust the government, and that around 53 don't trust them how they handled the crisis. But what actually comes out here is that even more, meaning around 62% by your data doesn't trust the democracy at all. So it's not just the government, they actually feel that the whole system is letting them down. So this is what I find most, let's say, disturbing in somehow, that that actually means that our institutions are not working as they should, or at least as people perceive them, and that the whole structure needs to be somehow dealt with. And so this is something which I cannot somehow, and let's say in comparison, the data with Hungary is not so disturbing in this sense. There are different, possible explanations. I would go with the one which I somehow follow for several years now, that that somehow Slovenian public opinion to some extent is a kind of a beautiful soul, that we hear no evil or see no evil, but everything is constantly wrong. And actually this nicely corresponds actually with the development of how the political parties and the governments and the election results changed in last 15 years. In last 15 years, actually, at least on this, in Slovenia, in this liberal left side, there is a constant shift or change in the preferences. We had, if I remember correctly, around 4 or 5 elections, and in last 15 years, from 2007, 2008, and comparing with the so-called conservative right spectrum, where there is a huge continuity of the current prime minister party, on the so-called liberal left, there is absolutely no party which let's say was established in either in 2008 or 11 and so on, which would still be in the political podium. So in Slovenia, on this side of political spectrum, parties are popping up just 2 months before the election, and incredibly, usually they get a huge support, up to 30%, and those new prime ministers or new party leaders which become prime minister lead the party, and so on and so on. So in this sense, something quite, let's say, not yet democratic is going on. Actually, I think that this is still a kind of a reflex of a transitional period in Slovenia. This is still a kind of a idea of democracy establishment process, and this somehow actually corresponds with the data, or at least this one which I feel it's the most somehow disturbing. Other is more or less, let's say, I wouldn't say the other findings are more or less quite, let's say, probably quite similar as in other countries would be. So yeah, and in this sense, maybe the COVID crisis or COVID period now only made these divisions and cleavages even stronger, and this somehow then later also goes towards the what Natasha pointed out, the aggressive media campaigns, communication processes, and so on. So there could be some, let's say, probably some similarities drawn between Slovenia and Hungary in this spectrum, but we could go deeper into this later. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting explanation, and maybe because if the Slovenian electorate is more volatile, then it explains why there's a higher distrust in political or against political institutions. But let's turn to the Hungarian case, and I'm looking at András, this small window. So as an expert of human rights, as an advocate of human rights, how would you evaluate the lockdown measures in Hungary? Really at the right after the outbreak of the pandemic. So we are talking about the first wave. Please, András.
It's interesting because in Hungary it wasn't the government rushing forward and then people criticizing the government for being too harsh. It was quite the other way around. So if you remember, mid-March, actually there was a big discussion about whether schools should be locked down. And on one sunny Friday morning, the Prime Minister gave his regular weekly interviews and said that there would be no school lockdowns because they were not necessary. And by the evening, the whole thing changed and he appeared on TV in a dramatic footage and announced that schools would be actually locked down. Which is probably due to the extreme public pressure that I think is, on the other hand, due to the information arriving from across Europe, Italy, because the epidemic hit Hungary relatively late at a time when it was already possible to assess and measure what fatal consequences it might have if it's not handled properly. So in this regard, I think the Hungarian society was quite patient and tolerant in the first wave. That's what we're talking about. And actually, I have to say that many of the lockdown measures were reasonable, and the society was quite disciplined, and I think this contributed to what we can call the success of handling the first wave with low numbers, low mortality, and the relative quick recovery when it comes to the healthcare situation. Now, what I find very interesting about the data, you said that we might comment on that, is the amount or the percentage of people who say that media freedom, freedom of speech, information freedom didn't change or even became better during this first wave. The percentages, if we add up, are around 60%, which is actually more, I think, but correct me because I'm not a political scientist. It's more than the core supporters of Fidesz within the Hungarian population. And I think the funny paradoxical reason for this is exactly that the freedom, access to information became much worse during the crisis. So if I have to criticize, and I will be happy to, as you know, representative of a watchdog organization, the government is that, as any good old-fashioned liberal regime would do, what they try to do is monopolize information. There were online centralized press conferences of the operative unit that was in charge of handling the epidemic. They only responded to questions from government-friendly media. We can probably later on we will go deeper into this, but there were other measures by the government, for instance, the prolongation of the deadline to respond to freedom of information requests. So the government took a number of actions that made it possible that the numbers are in their hands, and anyone else had a very difficult time if they wanted to dig deep into that number, into those numbers. So in fact, what happened is, I think, access to information, media freedom, freedom of expression, the situation in all these areas deteriorated, which made it more difficult for people to get information about what was really going on. And actually, this might paradoxically be the reason that many people, and not only Fidesz supporters, feel that there was no deterioration or even some improvement in these areas. The biggest issue in this regard was the very abrupt evacuation of hospitals. In mid-April, the Minister of Healthcare ordered hospitals to evacuate 60% of their beds within 1 week, practically. This meant, I think, close to 40,000 hospital beds. And because it had to be in a hurry, a lot of people who would have been in need of serious medical care were discharged overnight, basically, into their homes, if they had any. And this was an issue that triggered outcry within the Hungarian society. And I think that incident, or that kind of series of events, showed how unwilling the government to give the numbers, because not even the Hungarian Medical Chamber was provided with the calculations based on which such a serious measure was ordered, with, I have to repeat again, 1 week to actually comply. And some hospital directors were removed for resisting this order, saying that they needed to take care of the existing patient. So, and I think that showed that, the response of the minister to the Hungarian Medical Chamber's open letter asking for the calculations was, you are just creating tensions, you are just making politics here, and no answers were given. So I think one of the key areas where there was a very serious deterioration from the human rights perspective was exactly the accessibility of information. That's why I find it very interesting that when you look at the Hungarian numbers, what you see is actually a higher percentage of those thinking that there was no change, or even there was a change to the better, than the usual core supporting group of Fidesz, which I think is exactly because information was withheld. So this kind of feeling that everything is in order could be maintained.
Thank you very much, András. Judith, we had a lot of reflections on the data. I also want to ask you if you would like to respond to these inputs, and also how have you personally, or as a researcher, how would you evaluate the long-term measures from the aspect of public opinion researcher, and from the aspect of politics?
Thank you. Yes, I would like to reflect on the topic of the information freedom. Just add one more thing, that it is also important to remember that in the first weeks, I'm not sure the amount of time, but in the beginning there were not even demographically detailed information about the coronavirus cases. So it is also, I think, a very important question. And in connection with the question of human rights and also the freedom of speech, I think here we could mention the Authorization Act, which was a very important measure during this time. And just to very basically summarize what was it about. It gave the possibility to the government to rule by decree, and one of the most important critique of this law was that it didn't contain a time limit. And in connection with the freedom of speech, there was a part in this law where the rule of spreading fake news is changed, and it could be punished by prison. And there were some cases where the police started proceedings because of Facebook posts, because they said that these were challenged to combat the protection of the virus. Sorry, Daniel, what was the second part of your question? Could you repeat it, please?
This was the second part of my question. So how would you evaluate the lockdown measures from the aspect of human rights? You mentioned the emergency situation, so the Authorization Act, and this one case when someone was basically arrested by the police. But maybe you can reflect upon what Sebastian thought. That did you see any kind of interrelation between public attitude vis-a-vis the coronavirus and party affiliation? I mean, party preferences. So, is there a difference between, let's say, in Hungary, what was the supporters of Fidesz party? What was their opinion? How did they evaluate the lockdown measures by the government and the state of human rights?
Yes, I think these kind of situations where there are a lot of fears in people, they really need to feel that they can trust the government, the actor that has the power, and these situations make good condition for the government. So maybe it could give them more support. But of course, we are getting very close to 2022. The next parliamentary election, and I think it will be very interesting that how this whole coronavirus situation has an effect on the political situation.
Thank you very much, Jutka. Natasha already spoke about scapegoating, which is going to be my next question. So in such a situation, in such an emergency situation, have you seen any kind of sign of that certain groups of the society have been scapegoated if there's been any kind of tension in the society, and maybe if any kind of groups wanted to exploit these tensions during the last half year? Maybe Natasha, you can continue, because you already mentioned this topic.
Yes, and I mentioned that the members of the media and the journalists were really huge targets. In the early days of the crisis, the government banned the presence of reporters at press conferences, and instead releasing daily televised statements by cabinet members. Now, journalists, however, were able to refer their questions to the government communication office, facing criticism from the Association of Journalists. The government communication office introduced later a moderator in the studio who was taking questions from the media. But as I mentioned, within days of assuming power, the Prime Minister and his Slovenian Democratic Party started accusing public broadcaster of lying. Like, one of the tweets of our Prime Minister was, and I'm quoting, "Don't spread lies. TV Slovenia, we pay you to keep us informed in these times, not to mislead the public. Apparently, there are too many of you and you are paid too well." This was one of his tweets. in the following days, the weeks and months, our Prime Minister even published an essay, War with the Media, on governmental websites. Now we have Minister of Culture proposing changes to media laws. If they are adopted, the experts warn that the consequences could really be far-reaching. We had just recently, at the end of September, a rule of law report about, and Slovenia was listed among countries where journalists were particularly faced threats and attacks. Now there is numerous deployment of so-called SLAPP lawsuits, threats to physical safety. Some of my colleagues actually experienced that. Online harassment, I've been on Twitter since 2007, 2008, and the current situation, I mean, it's never been as difficult to be online, to express your opinion, especially for female journalists. Smear campaigns, intimidation, politically oriented threats. Now, Slovenia was highlighted in this report as one of the countries where things are happening more frequently as in others. Now, attacks on the media in general and national broadcaster in particular continue to this day. Even the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, was calling on the Slovenian authorities to restrain from exerting undue political pressure on the public broadcaster. The sector that's been very much criticized from the government side is the culture and creativity sector. Unlike some other countries, and they are protesting for, I think, 25 Friday is a day when people in Slovenia are protesting against government, against the measures. And they have been doing now that for 24, 25 Fridays in a row. Unlike some other countries, Slovenia only took urgent social measures to help the affected. I also hear many of my colleagues working for NGOs and activists who are advocating for various minority groups. They are telling me they've been replaced and thrown out of the government working bodies. They are left out of the decision-making processes during the crisis. And the group that feels particularly targeted are also the activists and advocates for cleaner environment. There are certain changes that will affect their industry. I mean, we can definitely expect that the country's top court to deal with corona measures for years to come. Some related to financial and economic consequences of stimulus packages, some to other aspects such as possible human rights restrictions and violations. I mean, I've been talking about communicating, and I think that of course there are always groups that will object to whatever government A or B, whatever measures they would be taking. I mean, you can't win with some groups, but I believe the general understanding in the country is that restrictions are necessary to spread the virus, to contain spreading the virus. But the way the current government is communicating that, it gives a feeling that they are seeing crisis not so much as medical, but as a security issue. So they adopted a number of degrees and actions related to giving an army greater powers, giving a police greater powers, which current results of surveys measuring how people trust the government show that they may not feel this is the way forward. Just on Friday, there came out a survey. They were measuring the public trust in the 20 people that are most frequently communicating government's measures. And the ones with the worst level of trust among the people are the Prime Minister, the Interior Minister, the public spokesman for the corona crisis, and the head of a National Institute of Health. So you can imagine where we are at the moment. People do trust the doctors, the epidemiologists, the experts from the field, but more and more they object to the way that the government is handling the crisis. And as I mentioned, among the groups, the media, the culture sector, the creativity sector, they have not been on the same level with, I mean, the government is not feeling this is a group they should be working with. So maybe that.
Thank you, Natasha. I'm asking Sebastian that what could be in the background of these developments that in a case of such an emergency situation and during a pandemic, at least for me, suddenly the scapegoating of the media begins, and it seems like there are more probably structural conflicts in the background, which were some kind of conflicts or disagreements have been triggered by the pandemic. Could you explain it us? Why the Slovenian government reacts so harshly?
Yeah, probably. Just for the let's say to continue where Natasha stopped, she mentioned a official spokesperson for COVID-19. This is a kind of a let's say extraordinary intervention. Usually, such individuals are not introduced, but you know, this person, which is functioning as a official spokesperson, is the same person which was the official spokesperson of the first, or even maybe even not the government, but during the 90s, in the beginning of the 90s, where Slovenia was separating from Yugoslavia. So he was the official spokesperson for the biggest security issue which Slovenia went through when there was a short war against the then Yugoslavian army, and he was now reintegrated or reinstalled as a spokesperson. So from this sense, I can, you know, this is quite clear picture. You know, this person is a communicator. He was extremely successful in 1990s, but this is now we have a health issue. We don't really have a security issue which endangers our lives in the sense that there is an attack by a foreign force which is going to annihilate us. You know, so in this sense, you know, this is a kind of a practical, let's say, you know, this is a clear feeling by people which actually feel that the communication part is being a bit too harsh on them. But maybe if we go even deeper into this, there is, you know, I have a thesis that the Slovenian, let's say, political arena actually never came across to be a, let's say, now it's going actually against the respect of each other, but actually it's not compromising enough. it's not just the fault of the current government, which is now trying to handle the crisis, but both these sides, which are, let's say, the main political sides in Slovenia. Actually, the previous government, just before this one, which took place on the day when one day after the first COVID infection, the first person was found. Actually, the government before was established on the premise that they will at any way they can allow the current Prime Minister Janez Janša to get the government again. So a kind of a complete exclusion of this more conservative right political spectrum out of the governmental space, or in the sense allowance to be able to, let's say, to govern the state. So this is something which is going on for several years now, and it is dangerous by itself. The compromise, I think, it's a basic of any political, let's say, reality. And in this sense, Slovenian political reality is becoming more and more exclusive and more aggressive to each other. And the first clear result is media and let's say these public appearances, discussions, and the social media conversations between these two political spectrums. So I think this is something which needs to be addressed carefully in the future, and our most responsible politicians, as let's say the president of the country, judicial system, and so on, need somehow to find solutions. I'm not saying that we need, or in any way, let's say a common goal for the whole country, for everybody. I think that there is this proverb, divided we will stand, together we will fall. I still believe it, but in a sense, there needs to be some understanding of each other's interests, because political ideologies are different. A liberal democracy is probably our common goal, but there are ideological differences which need to be taken into consideration. And just to let's say address one other group which was extremely scapegoated in this sense, which is actually not even of Slovenian origins, is immigrants. This was something which was, or it still is, at least addressed by the right government, which is now in power, as one of the biggest threats to the Slovenian, let's say, self-being or independence. Not just that they are stealing our jobs and so on, and that they are they're even spreading the virus all the time. So in this sense, what Natasha said, that the police and army, military got bigger, or at least they want to get more power, is also, and maybe even prevailingly, because of this immigrant threat, which is completely unsubstantiated in any data, at least for this year. So in this sense, it can be probably to some extent compared to Hungarian situation as well. This is something which is a bit frightening also, because I do agree, actually, it's not just a humanitarian problem. Actually, it's becoming a security one, which I don't know if it really is. Okay, this is from my side for this round.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. I'm turning to András because Sebastian said that the Slovenian and the Hungarian case can be compared also from this aspect when it comes to the scapegoating of refugees and migrants. What do you think? What about the scapegoating in Hungary during the pandemic? We can't hear you.
Yeah, it started off like that. So if you remember, the first two identified cases were Iranian students. I'm actually not even sure that they were the first identified ones, and it wasn't, people weren't waiting for some foreigners to be identified. But then the usual rhetoric started about this thing being an external threat that is brought in by the immigrants. Immigration is bad. A bunch of Iranian students who were contacted to the first two identified cases were taken to hospital. They were not provided with adequate English language information about what's going to happen to them. And then, while some of them caused the problem to the hospital staff, and based on the behavior of a couple of them, a whole group of Iranian students, I think like up to 15 people, were expelled from the country without the actual proceedings examining who did what in the hospital came to an end. So actually this was the scapegoating of foreigners, the scapegoating of immigrants was there. Then I think it got a bit flushed away by the general noise. I mean, everyone had acquaintances coming back from Austria, from skiing, coming back from a trip to Italy. And therefore, I think this became a kind of not credible after a while. So actually those scapegoating voices subsumed after a while. I think one interesting thing about scapegoating is the Authorization Act that Judith mentioned. The Authorization Act that really gave a kind of an absolutely unlimited mandate for the government to rule by decree, to overrule laws, to restrict fundamental rights beyond the test of proportionality and necessity, and without a sunset clause. Which is, I think, very interesting because the opposition said from the very beginning that, okay, we understand that this is a very special situation. We understand that you need extra powers and we are willing to give those extra powers to you, but we want a sunset clause. We want, the parliament after a while being able to look at what you have done with this authorization. And we also want some additional guarantees like an easier access to the Constitutional Court if there's any problem with these decrees. But the government said no and insisted on this unlimited authorization. And I don't think the real reason was that they, wanted to really kind of do a coup to the constitutional system. It was to set a political trap for the opposition, which then did not actually agree to the fast track voting on this law. And then the government started saying, okay, here we have an opposition that is not supporting the country, an opposition that is cheering for the virus. That's what the Hungarian government said. So there's another element of scapegoating of the opposition, after creating a situation when the opposition cannot responsibly say yes, although the opposition would have been willing to give extra powers with some additional guarantees. And the other thing that struck me as interesting is that, this kind of relationship between the trust in the government, the media, and the scapegoating. It was striking how much more trust the Hungarians have in the government and how the government handled the crisis. And this is probably and the mistrust in Slovenia, which is probably due to the reporting of the independent media. In Hungary, when the government controls a very large segment of the media market, it could simply afford to sideline independent media by not responding to their questions during their online daily press briefings, and the ministries refusing to give answers. There was no need to scapegoat the media. It was enough to sideline it because the government has a large enough portion to still feed information that it likes to the country. So basically, when we talk about scapegoating, it was the usual suspects, foreigners from Iran, Muslim immigrants, so to say, the opposition. And there was this very interesting game with the media. There was no need to scapegoat. There was no need to wage a war. It was easy to sideline them. So I think that's these are my thoughts when it comes to the issue of scapegoating.
András, thank you very much. Judith, I'm asking you if you want to add something to the Hungarian case on scapegoating.
Yes, I think we could talk about one more group of the society that we can think of as a victim of scapegoating, and this would be the elderly, the older people, because we could face a lot of content in the social media where people criticize the older generations that they don't follow the rules. They go out even if it is not okay this time, so I think this is one more group that we should mention in connection with scapegoating.
Well, as a matter of fact, during the whole pandemic, I think so. We discussed the very negative developments, but also I think there's this kind of a positive development which we could witness during the pandemic, and this is the growth of in volunteerism, how people volunteered to help each other and to assist, for example, to senior citizens. Do you think that it's just a temporal thing, or do you think that it could somehow boost civil society in East Central Europe, or how could it be? Is it a political act actually, or is it about political rights? I mean, participation, or it just may be a temporary community action, and it's not really something which could boost civil society in East Central Europe? And maybe now we can start with Judith at this round.
Okay. Yes, I think it was a very interesting and important thing that people started to volunteer, and it, as I remember, it started very soon. A lot of people had their own relatives who are from the older generations, but a lot of people have their neighbors go to shopping instead of them go to the pharmacy, that they don't have to go there. And I think that it was one of the main topic in volunteering. And the other one that was very important, and I think it's a very important thing to mention tonight, the education that we could experience, that a lot of people helped students who didn't have the required technical, they didn't have a laptop or tablet, so people helped out each other to make it possible that as many students as possible can join the online learning, and students also have to face another difficulty that especially university students, that they had to leave their dorms. So there was another very big problem that they had to deal with, that if they can go home to their family, they could go home, but if they have a job in the city where they study, So there were a lot of questions, but it was, I think, a very great experience to see that how many people helped each other. And of course, there was one more thing, the homemade mask, that a lot of people started sewing masks, and I think it's also important to mention as this became a basic accessory of our lives today. So I think it was also a very important development in this topic, and hopefully these experiences will keep going on, and people will keep think it is an important thing to volunteer, even if it's not a pandemic.
Thank you very much, Judith. András, a lot of very frequently we talk about polarization in Hungary, political polarization, but this momentum of voluntarism, do you see as kind of a sign of a social integrity, that at the end of the day, there is a political community which people can help for each other in a case of emergency?
I think, yes, it's a very important development. I mean, if we look at, again, your data saying that, how important actors' actions are, and you see the government being at 82% in Hungary, which kind of reflects this usual stereotype that we have, that we are too reliant on the state, and this kind of is not always there. But when we look at individual responsibility, we see that it's even greater, and not only in Slovenia but also in Hungary. So I think it might be a push to civil society in this region to see that you cannot always rely on the government, especially when things are rough. Your government might not be the source of, protection and inspiration you have to look to. You have to take things into your own hand. And I think this can be the beginning of this kind of realization after, 30 years of democracy. I think it's a long process. I mean, this kind of institutionalization that the communist socialist regimes created, it takes a lot to get rid of that. And maybe it takes a kind of crisis like this to start this process for real.
Thank you very much, András. Sebastian, what about the Slovenian civil society? Did it gain an impetus, like in Hungary, as probably as elsewhere as well?
Yeah. Do please let me say something else before I turn to the civil society. I think it must be said that anyhow that regardless of the data which was collected with the survey, I must say this, but at least it's my opinion that the measures which were introduced by the government until now were more or less great. They were extremely good. I think they were super in the sense of containing the virus. In this sense, all the partial lockdowns and such stuff, somehow I think it had to be done in order to suppress the infection. And this is to some extent also the answer to what someone who here in the Zoom webinar chat who wrote a question, which one is it? No, there are even more. What are the alternative strategies to do you feel could stop transmission as effectively as restrictive government measures? I don't think that any government in the world at this point had any idea how to tackle this issue. They are trying as best as they can, some better, some worse. If we compare somehow the situations to some extent with Hungary, between Hungary and Slovenia, actually we never had a curfew in this sense. Our government never introduced the so-called Authorization Act, though it somehow contemplated it for some time. But and if I include now civil society into it, civil society in this sense was not just let's say included into the aid support. It was extremely influential, and it still is, in containing some of the government ideas to let's say introduce measures which maybe would not go into the right direction. In this sense, Natasha already mentioned an idea of using police officers together with army, or army itself on the borders of Slovenia to somehow this was connected to the refugee idea, so-called refugee crisis. That the argument behind was that army needs to be put on the borders to stop all the refugees trying to get into the country and across country, and that they're spreading the virus and they're dangerous and so on. So civil society in this sense was or still is instrumental, to somehow to keep checks and balances to some extent, which is important. No government, if it has such an, let's say, a contra argument which is able to be heard, allows itself to introduce measures which they know that are going to let's say come back against her, against the public opinion. The public opinion is going to be changed by such measures, and in this sense, civil society has more or many tasks now. Also, in a sense, as it was already mentioned, as a humanitarian or charity work. There is a proverbial, let's say, support and help in Slovenia by the neighbors and the family, and this is definitely going on now, and it's probably going to be, because it's going to be even more important after now that what we can see is going on across the whole Europe, that the number of cases is spiking as never before. The situation in the fall is going to be probably much worse than in the spring, and all these subsystems are definitely going to be on challenged.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Natasha, I'd just like to ask if you share the optimism of Sebastian about the long-lasting effect of the pandemic-related voluntarism.
Well, I definitely hope that it will continue. I can agree with all my predecessors that at least, and it was quite evident in the first month of the epidemic, people were really helping each other, offering help for homes for the elderly. I myself and lots of my friends volunteered for organizations like Red Cross, to help people in case they might need to go somewhere, or to bring food or grocery from the stores, or just to go out and take a walk with his or her dogs. I was not called even once. I assume that was because a lot of people offered help, and they didn't. I mean, they had really, at least what they told me, they had a lot of help from all parts of the country. I remember the first month, and it was probably the same in Hungary, when lots of Slovenians, we like to travel. So we were all over the world when all these restrictive measures came into play. So the government was trying hard, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to get everyone back to Slovenia, because, you know, the public transportations, the air traffic, everything was closing down. We have a consul who is a very experienced guy, and his rhetoric is quite colorful. So it was also an example of good communication from the government part as to how to, you know, ask people to cooperate, to go further, and solidarity in the first month or two were definitely something that everyone noticed. If that will hold, this is probably a question for, I don't know, a sociologist or I don't know, anthropologists or scientists who have been more into this. I don't have at disposal currently a data that I would be able to share to show you, you know, what was the level of solidarity among Slovenians at that very difficult time. The crisis definitely pointed out that probably instead of, I think Andras said something like that, instead of waiting for the government to do everything, sometimes we, you know, need to do some certain things also ourselves. And because, you know, times are very difficult, we are asking a lot of the people. The restrictions are hard on people. It's been 7 months and it's not stopping. We are entering the second wave, which will probably, as Sebastian said, be at least according to numbers we are seeing right now in Slovenia, it's going to be looks like it's going to be much worse. So you need support from the people, and this is something that I think the elites that are governing Slovenia and are asking Slovenians to follow the measures will need to take a closer look at how good they are doing this, so that we won't need to transform Slovenia into a police state, that police would be roaming the streets or the army personnel and inspecting whether people are following the rules, with which, you know, to be honest, they need to be followed in order if you want to contain the spread of the virus. But yeah, I am an optimist. I definitely do hope that the solidarity will be something that we'll experience. We have to, as Sebastian said, together we stand, divided we fall.
Thank you very much, Natasha. We don't have much time left, but we have a question from Kester Eddy. And this is a question to all panelists, but I'd just like to ask you if someone want to, or more of you want to answer the question. I think you can also see the question in the chat, but I'm going to read it for those who are following the event on Facebook. So Kester Eddy's question is whether the results of the survey are more an indicator of the freedom of the media in the respective countries. That is, do Slovenes distrust their government because there is a free press there, able to report on government mistakes, whereas in Hungary, the media is dominated far more by government-controlled media. If anyone wants to answer.
If I may, this was
yes.
The thing that I was trying to refer to, might not have been clear on this, but this might be a reason. And this might also be the reason why the Slovenian government was so harsh on the, much harsher on the Slovenian media than the Hungarian government was on Hungarian media. Plus, I think in Hungary, there was this kind of really like a lucky coincidence, as I mentioned, between the expectations of people as far as the measures to be followed based on the scare that came from Italy and the government's actual measures. So I think if you look at what happened and how much it was in line with what the people wanted in the first wave, I think there was a great deal of coincidence and luck, and I'm not sure that the same is going to be true for the second wave, because it seems it's going to be much more difficult to balance the healthcare and the economic aspects of the crisis now than it was during the spring, when it wasn't immediately clear what kind of toll these measures would take on economy.
Thank you, András. Natasha, you like to?
You just wanted to add that there is no question that media in Slovenia are free to write, report on whatever they wish to. Are they? So the status is, I believe, a bit different than in Hungary, where my colleagues tell me that most of the media, or majority, is under one or the other type of government control. That is not the case in Slovenia. Are members of the media under attack? Yes, like never before. We had weeks ago a report from International Press Institute saying that the situation in Slovenia, that Slovenian media is under attack like in no other country at the moment. Minister of Culture proposed already changes to media laws, controversial legislative amendments to the public broadcaster and the press agency. And it was only thanks to widespread protests and criticism from international bodies that the government accepted to subject the bills to a meaningful public consultation. As I mentioned earlier, if changes are adopted, then the consequences could be really, really bad for the freedom of the press in Slovenia. So the situation is slightly different than in Hungary, but if things continue as they are today, when you have, international bodies saying that few countries have experienced such a swift downturn in press and media freedom after a new government came to power in Slovenia. The veteran Prime Minister Janez Janša, the few countries have experienced that. So if this trend continues, then on the lists of how free the media are in certain countries, then we might see Slovenia not being among the best in that regard in the world anymore.
Thank you very much, Natasha. I'm asking the others if you want to add something to, or if you want to answer the question. If not, then unfortunately we are out of time, so we should close this event. We've been discussing the lockdown, the COVID-related lockdown, and the impact of the pandemic on human rights in Slovenia and in Hungary, with Natasha Brisky, who is the editor-in-chief of Matters List, András Kádár, co-chair of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, Sebastian Pikl, managing director of the Novum think tank from Slovenia, and Judit Székely, researcher of the Republikon Institute. Thank you for all the panelists for being with us and for accepting the invitation from Republikon Institute. And I'd like to thank for the viewers for being with us. We are going to have a publication, as I already mentioned, on the human rights and the integration of human rights and pandemic-related lockdowns in East Central Europe. We also go beyond the Hungarian and the Slovenian case. We also are going to discuss the Polish case and the situation in the Czech Republic. Natasha Brisky and Judith Székely are the contributors of this publication, among others. And we are going to share that publication on this event's Facebook site as well, so the viewers won't miss anything. Thank you very much again for your presence, and thank you very much for being with us. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.